Anand Giridharadas is the author of India Calling, an intimate portrait of a nation's remaking from 2011, and The True American, Murder and Mercy in Texas from 2014. He's an editor-at-large for the Time magazine and was a foreign correspondent and columnist for the New York Times from 2005 to 2016. He has also written for The Atlantic, The New Republic, and The New Yorker. He has been an on-air political analyst for MSNBC, a visiting scholar at the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute at New York University, and a former McKinsey analyst. His two TED Talks, A Tale of Two Americas and A Letter to All Who Have Lost in This Era, have each received well over 1 million views. Our other guest is Steve Scher, who most of you are familiar, is a podcaster, broadcaster, writer, interviewer, and a teacher. He's the former host of KUOW-FM's Weekday and has taught interviewing at the University of Washington since 2009. His in-depth interviews with award-winning authors, political leaders, scientists, artists, and active citizens are noted for their intelligence and sensitivity. He recently moved into podcasting and is excited to be part of the social movement that is democratizing access. Steve is currently chief correspondent of Town Hall's Insider Podcast, In the Moment, as well as the host of the podcast series, At Length with Steve Scher. Today, we're having a paperback release of Anand's exciting book, Winners Take All, The Elite Charade of Changing the World. And it is the subject of tonight's talk. Please join me in welcoming Anand Giridharadas and Steve Scher.
What a room we are in. Hello, Seattle. 8 billionaires in the house.
Can you see it all, what this room is and the work they did? They did a nice job. Hey, may I just say that Dan Hooper, about the first 10 to the minus 30 seconds of the universe, is, it's worth going to. I read his book, I talked to him for the podcast. He's great. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you.
Okay, we're gonna start with a couple of big ideas so we know where we're going. Winners take all, the elite charade of changing the world. Break that down for me.
How much time do you have? I'm going to work backwards. Book publishing is about the management of conflict with your publisher. It's not really about informing the public about important topics. And this title and subtitle is the result of a compromise. So the subtitle is mine, The Elite Charade of Changing the World. And the title was my editor's. And this was the truce we worked out. And the reason I love it now, even though I fought it at the time, was the subtitle is a description of the con, of the game that I am trying to illustrate and explicate in this book. Rich people, the richest and most powerful people in this country, using the idea of doing good, and often the genuine practice of doing some good, to distract us from the fact that they are pickpocketing us at the exact same time. And so the elite charade of changing the world. What I think my editor, John Siegel at Knopf, was very smart in pushing me on, even though I resisted it for a moment, was the question of what's the payoff of their doing this. I was very focused on how they do it, on actually going into this world of the plutocrats and reporting on them, interviewing, understanding in minute detail how rich people rule us by claiming to help. But he was very mindful of what's the result of this practice. And the result of this practice, as you know well in Seattle, and we should talk about Seattle. You got a little bit of this problem here? Yep. Is that fewer and fewer people clean up more and more of everything. And the rest of us are left in this weird emotional state that is defined by wondering why the world is like this, right? Like, have you felt this emotion over the last few years? Like, we all felt it with Trump, but it's not only Trump, right? You read the Boeing story, you think, what kind of people would prefer to not have the plane properly regulated and are willing to be like, a couple crashes wouldn't be so bad? Who are these people? What kind of people feel it's more important for the richest man in the world to pay a little less in taxes than to solve homelessness in Seattle? What are the dynamics in a culture that allows a genuinely good man, I think, and champion of children, Bill Gates, who I think is more of a genuine philanthropist than a lot of people I write about, to decide to spend a lot of time with Jeffrey Epstein, a child rapist, and lie about it potentially to New Yorker fact checkers and others? Like, what is going on? Do you feel bewildered about this stuff the way I do? This is the kind of, like, we don't have a bad apple problem, right? We have an orchard problem. And this is in the soil, it's in the roots, it's in the water, it's in the air, everything. I don't know a lot about orchards, as some of you who do may be realizing right now. I've been to like 3 orchards in my life. But I think we have to move from an apple paradigm, bad apple paradigm, to an orchard, bad orchard paradigm. And the book, in some ways, is an attempt to understand how the whole orchard got poisoned.
All right, and we're going to come back to that and to this, but just to start big. Wave your magic wand. What does the world look like where the orchard is flowering with health? To use your, orchard.
I like it. I think the answer to a winners-take-all world, almost logically, is a world in which the winners take less. But that would be just the first step of the kind of flourishing that I would hope for. And the kind of flourishing I would hope for, think about it this way. We have lived in a glorious age of innovation. Now, again, going back to the emotion, my guess is it doesn't necessarily feel that way to us. But if I put the facts to you, you can't deny it. More new stuff has been invented in the lifetime of people in this room, more consequential new stuff, mind-blowing new stuff, so that some kid in a village in India now has all the world's information available to them on a phone in a way that you also do. The stuff that has happened in our lifetime is crazy. And the puzzle is, how is it that so much innovation, which is the Latin word for new shit, has failed to translate into progress, which is a different word than innovation, if progress means most people's lives getting better? And so, for me, the answer to the positive vision is, I think if we started to break the plutocratic monopoly on the future itself, if we actually allowed the rainwater of innovation to sprinkle on everybody, I think you'd start to see a society awaken with health. You'd start to see people, if you like businesses, you'd start to see people starting way more businesses because they weren't afraid of losing their health care if they did. If you like children, you'd start to see more parents spending more time with their children and investing in them instead of having to work 4 jobs to survive. If you like airplane safety, you would maybe see airplanes being regulated by the government instead of Boeing writing regulations to save itself a little bit of time and money. I get to travel a lot to other countries as part of my work. And I don't, like, every time I come back to America, it's a very diffuse feeling that I'm about to describe, and it's not something at the level of, like, analytical rigor that I could put in a book yet. But America just feels like tired and bloated and not healthy to me every time I come back. And then when I stay here a while, it gets normal, and then I go somewhere else and I come back, including many European countries that are, 30 to 40% poorer than us on a per capita basis. But their subways are just decent. People's physiology doesn't look so worn down. We are wearing ourselves down with the way we force people to work, the lack of services we provide, the complete casino of finance that governs everybody's lives, an education system that basically only gives you a good education if you don't really need one because you have rich parents. And I think if we were to start to imagine a different kind of society in the way that there are figures in the political stage trying to get us to, I think the big phrase that comes to mind, the phrase philosophers often use, is human flourishing. And I'm back at my orchard metaphor.
Okay, a lot of stuff there. But since you mentioned them, let's just break down those first three dudes. We were downstairs, Amazon and Jeff Bezos contributing, I forget the number now, 1-point-something million to the city council, or a little less. Well, he's got a lot of money, and money is speech, and so, or money is freedom and speech, it's both. So fine, let him contribute to a city council race. Is that really undermining our democracy?
Yes.
Tell me why. Or tell me what we could do different.
So there's two answers. I want to give a moral answer to this question because I think we can't forget a certain basic level of moral thinking before we get to the practical. These microphones definitely ordered on Amazon.
Amazon's choice.
Wow, that was. I think there's a moral answer to this question and a more practical one. We got to start with the moral one. Let's just slow down a second. You guys are so used to this guy, this story, this issue. Just slow down. This is the richest or second richest person on the planet.
Yeah, this week.
There have been some events in his personal life as well as stock price. He's one of the richest people, not just in America, in the world, and not just in the world, but to have ever walked in Allbirds' shoes or on the face of the earth.
Only King Mike.
And it's a level of wealth that I think many of you might agree with me that if we had that, what I hope would happen to us is that we would become above it, right? All the lies we have to tell because we have to pay mortgages and, all the things we have to do that we don't entirely love, but we got to do it for our kids or whatever. You'd think, like, if you had that kind of money, you'd be the most honest motherfucker on earth, right? That's what we hope. Because you'd be free. You could actually do the right thing if you had that kind of money. You could. You could be incorruptible. You don't need anything. You don't need anything if you have that kind of money. And the idea that someone with that kind of money thinks it's important to prevent the people of this city acting democratically by their choice, first on the $250 head tax some time ago, now with the election, exerting collective choice to address a housing crisis and a homelessness crisis, thinks that it's important that that rich person intercepts that, blocks it, makes it not happen. Before we get to the practicals of money in politics or taxing the hell out of someone like that, there's just a moral issue of like, did your mama not raise you right? Like, what went wrong in our culture that is a socially acceptable way of being? And I say that before saying the other thing, partly because I actually think we all have way more power in a way over our culture than we do over some of these harder structures, although we do have power over the hard structures. But we have to own the fact that we all participate in a culture that valorizes money-making, that valorizes billionaires, that puts them on the covers of things, that treats them as thinkers even though they're not. And we can all stop participating in that culture in a way that would immediately strip these emperors of the illusion of having clothes. On the more practical front, like, we should get money out of politics via constitutional amendment. As a way station to getting there, I am all in favor of onerous disclosure requirements, which do not require constitutional amendment, that would just make it a real pain in the ass to give a lot of money to politics, right? You gotta list all your tax returns for all your businesses, your double Irish with a Dutch sandwich maneuver that your company used, put that in there. And I'm glad you guys laughed at that. I went to the Netherlands last week, and I tweeted as I was arriving that I'm looking forward to eating one of these double Irish with a Dutch sandwiches. And I get all these replies being like, I don't know about that sandwich, but there's an amazing salami sandwich at this place in Amsterdam. You should check it out. And I was like, you guys don't even know about the tax loophole that is like the defining thing of your country right now in the world. But anyway, I'm glad you guys are so aware of tax havens. That's both exciting and scary.
All right, but I thought earlier you were going to say the solution is for the democratic institutions that have calcified or decayed to be raised up by the citizens who need to step up to do that. And you mentioned downstairs Teddy Roosevelt, who was a different kind of president than the president we have today. So by that token, if we are an educated citizenry, why should Jeff Bezos' $1 million buy the election?
This is a great question. And, you know, my book, it's funny, when people meet me or come to my events, they often think that I'm very different from my book, which is true. Like, I spend most of my non-book life, making jokes with people. And I'm a person with tremendous hope. And this book, I actually think this book's an incredibly hopeful book, but I think a lot of people don't read it that way, which I understand. But the reason I think it's hopeful is if you describe how 100,000 people are running a society for themselves and have tricked 300 million people into thinking that it's for their benefit, to me that's an incredibly hopeful thing in the inverse, which is that if 300 million people, or even 2 million people, wake up, if just 2 million people wake up, you're still 20 times more than them. And I actually think we are living through an awakening in this country. It's slow, it's unsteady, but with every day, with every passing story, I see a skepticism rising, and you're exactly right. First of all, I do not think the richest person in the world should be able to give that kind of money to influence a local election, to be clear. But that's actually not that much money, in another sense. In a city this big, it should be very easy to organize countervailing pressure. And many of us have failed to do this. I say all the time, it is remarkable to me, and I'm guilty of this as much as anybody else. It's remarkable to me that I have not missed a meeting in the Trump era. The roads in New York have never been blocked so that I couldn't get to a meeting. Nothing has been occupied in a way that I couldn't take the subway. Like, how is it not to minimize Vietnam or any other era of history where very serious and different issues were at stake and death was at stake. But I would certainly put what's happening now up there in terms of an existential threat to the life of the country. And nothing has come to a standstill. There's no general strikes. So you can moan the way I moan about plutocrats taking power, but you're right. There's this other thing we can do, whether it's voting, whether it's organizing, whether it's taking a 50% voter participation rate and getting it to 55, which would like blow out an election, whether it's filing lawsuits, whether it's occupying things and blocking things. And I think, frankly, we haven't done enough of that. And we have confused clicking for joining, and clicking is not joining. And we need to do a lot more joining and a lot less clicking. And when we do, the 100,000 people are not going to be that powerful.
So let's talk about market world and the concept of the win-win, because how we got here was us collectively believing in this idea. But and it doesn't start here, but in a way it starts with the arguments from the 80s that government bad, government fails, and what we need to do is unleash the entrepreneurial spirit of the modern person. And how do we get from there to people like Gates or Bezos thinking, I got all the money, so I must have some answers?
It's so interesting. You know, I often describe the elite do-gooding that masks this bad system as kind of trickle-down economics with a cherry on top. It's kind of it's like woke capitalism is sort of like a kinder, gentler version. It's like Milton Friedman in a really, really pretty dress. Just give you a minute to process that picture. So one way to tell the story is from the late 70s onward. There's phase one of this two-phase operation, and my book is about phase two. Phase one is what you said. Phase one is the war on government, and it's a frontal, people call it neoliberalism, and this is something that generally originates on the right, and it's frontal, right? Ronald Reagan, government is the enemy. I mean, you can go further back, the Trilateral Commission, the Powell Memo, business interests being very clear about needing to grab political power because they understood that there was 100,000 people, and unless you really concoct a set of cultural beliefs to make the interests of that 100,000 people seem like the interests of half the country, you're going to lose. And so there was anxiety in the 70s. The anxiety was converted into real messages, real power. Jane Mayer wrote an excellent book called Dark Money. I don't know if she's been here, but she should if she hasn't. That details how literally 5 families on the right pushed this, the Kochs, Richard Mellon, Scaife, others. And they achieved this frontal assault on not just government, but the idea of government. Right? Government is bad, regulation is bad, taxation is bad. Essentially, you can think about it this way. They waged a marketing campaign that made all of government seem like the DMV. Right? Like just this bloated, inefficient place, and it's just not true. It's not true, There are parts of the government that don't achieve amazing things, but like in my experience, having sat next to many businessmen on flights my whole life, it seems to me a lot of people in America are not engaged in anything important. I actually sit in airplanes all the time next to people who are doing something that the world would probably be better if they just weren't doing it, and they're usually in the private sector. So I just want to put that out there. Shout out to Bob, all the Bobs. It's always Bob. And the problem with what they did, that frontal approach, is that it's it runs out of steam after a while. It runs out of steam for the following reason. I mean, you have the government cut back, regulate less, tax less. You get some juice out of it maybe, some people are happy. But after a while, the following starts to happen. Rich people are making way more money than they would have otherwise made had you not done that, kind of obvious. Second obvious thing that starts to happen is a bunch of social problems start to multiply and fester. You know that in this city and other cities. Homelessness goes up, evictions go up, mental health issues are not tended, education suffers. And the government is not able, does not have its former power to redress these things, right? So now with this triple situation, if it was just left like that, what would happen? People are going to come for those 100,000 people who did this, right? That is not a good situation, okay? And this is where my story starts.
For the 100,000.
For the 100,000. It's not a stable situation. This is where my book comes in. Phase 2 of the operation, and I'm making it sound like this concerted thing. I mean, in some ways it's concerted, in other ways it's more emergent. But phase 2 is the 100,000, the very rich and powerful people stepping onto the scene and saying, oh my gosh, look at this scene. This is such a shame. Look at all these social problems just festering, festering, festering. And government just not able to solve. That's such a shame. I wish we had a capable government that could solve these problems. I believe in government. I love government. Why is there no government solving these problems? Well, you know what? Never mind. The country has blessed me. I will spend a little bit of the fortune that I made hurting those people to help those people. Some of those people. A fraction of those people. And so my book, in some ways, picks up where Jane's leaves off, which is first they conquered the culture of this society with the notion that government was bad. But as that started to run out of steam, they needed to add to that this additional layer of seeming like they were on the job of solving the problems they had caused.
Wait, do you think they're the same people? I mean, is Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos the same people who... They're not the same people who...
It's the same class of people.
Same class.
And part of where Jane's book is the handover to mine is what started on the right. It's easy to malign the Koch brothers, although it's not easy to malign them the way Jane Mayer maligns them, which is with receipts. But like, they're obvious villains, right? What I'm describing in phase 2 is that this culture then infected the left half of the political and cultural and economic elite in our country, right? So there's a bunch of billionaires on the right who actually don't believe in government and actually want a kind of anarchic, feudal world. And like, in some ways, I respect the transparency. And they fight for that world, they advocate for that world, they buy newspapers to spread the vision of that world, they lobby for, like, there's no incoherence. I'm actually being serious here. Like, you gotta respect, like, I think they're dead wrong.
Well, they won.
But there's an intellectual
election.
Honesty to the project. And they're not secretly saying something else over here that's intention. Like, it's super clear what kind of world the Koch brothers, the dead one as well as the living one, want. And they have podcasts in hell, so he'll be listening. In fact, hell is just like one really long podcast session. Yeah, just loops. And so this culture started to spread to the left half, where you start to have, and this is where it gets really interesting, right? Most of the people I write about in the book probably vote for Democrats, right? Jamie Dimon, who I had an interesting phone call with the other day. These guys now sometimes call me to like process their feelings. And most of them remember to say off the record before. Jamie Dimon is not the sharpest pencil in the box.
Hey, what are they process? What is this? What feelings is he processing?
What?
What feelings is he processing?
Jamie Dimon is processing the feelings of being someone who is a Democrat, who believes in equality, believes in justice. In his mind, he is not a Koch brother. I think he genuinely thinks he is not the slightly handsomer third Koch brother. I genuinely think he thinks he's not a Koch brother. But he's wrong. Because he is a de facto Koch brother, right? Mark Zuckerberg, I'm sure, does not think he's a Koch brother. I'm sure he does not. And to be clear, like, I think Mark Zuckerberg probably totally believes in immigration, in gay rights, in a bunch of things that in his mind justify the position that he is not a Koch brother. But for our purposes in this room, he might as well be a Koch brother. This is sort of the point.
Because
Okay.
of what?
So to deal with each of them in turn. Jamie Dimon, while despite believing all that stuff, believes in a vision in which the answer to the inequality that he recently bemoaned, and that he bemoaned on the phone call with me in August, the answer to it is business people like him voluntarily, on their own terms, fixing it when they want, however they want, if they want. He thinks the answer to a winners-take-all world is the winners leading the search for justice. And on our phone call, I pushed him on, he had led this effort by a group called the Business Roundtable, which you may have heard about. It's an umbrella organization representing 180-something of the biggest companies in America. It's basically, if corporate America speaks with a voice, that's the voice. And they made this important statement that, well, people said it was important in August, saying that after decades of claiming that the purpose of corporations is to benefit shareholders only, they now have observed what your 5-year-old child or grandchild already knew, which is the purpose of corporations is to not just benefit shareholders, but benefit a whole bunch of other stakeholders. And it's amazing how, like, people in the business world get amazing credit for discovering what is, like, completely obvious. So that goes out, and I was quoted in the New York Times article announcing that with a very critical view, saying, like, pledges of voluntary corporate virtue don't do anything. Like, I mean, every year, I announce that I'm not going to eat French fries anymore. I've eaten French fries every single year that I pledge that, right? Pledges are of limited power. And so he didn't like my quote. He called me with this conversation. And I kept pushing him. It's like, if you believe that corporations should care for the environment, care for workers, we have a fantastic tool for making sure they do. It's called the law. It's called regulation. It's called policy. It'll actually make it easier for you. You don't have to wake up every day and figure out how moral you want to be. It's just the law. Do I want to give her $7.25 an hour or $15 an hour? I don't like those pants. Maybe $7.25. Like, what a weird way to run a country, right? Let's just make it 15. Just stop getting in the way of us doing that kind of stuff. And he said, oh, no, we couldn't do that. Regulation doesn't really work. So this is what I mean when I say that he doesn't believe he's the slightly handsomer Koch brother. But at the end of the day, he is pushing for the same kind of world in which there is very little regulation and we are governed by gilded whims. And I would argue, and you may disagree with me here, in a way he is more dangerous than a Koch brother because we are more easily fooled by him. I don't think Barack Obama sat down or ever took advice from a Koch brother. Jamie Dimon is the kind of person he would listen to. And I'm not sure that's warranted. Same with Mark Zuckerberg. If you were some chemical industry executive in the Midwest, dumping sludge into an occasional river, as one does, I don't think Barack Obama would sit down with you, do a thing like this. But he did it with Mark Zuckerberg. Why? Because there's a glow, right? There's a glow of this guy believes in immigration, he's helping on that issue, he believes in this and that. And he's giving away his money to a for-profit entity, by the way, but and again, I'm convinced that Mark Zuckerberg believes he's not a Koch brother. I believe he's sincere in that faith, but he's wrong. Because in some ways, he's damaged this country even more than the Koch brothers, which is hard to do. But by providing a platform for foreign cyber war on this country to elect the most dangerous, racist, misogynist president in the history of this country, and to basically not act quickly enough and to deter journalists and government regulators who were trying to get in there to figure out what's going on, to keep them out because you didn't want your growth lust interfered with. It's criminal. I mean, I have said for months now that we're having the wrong conversation about Mark Zuckerberg, right? The important question about Mark Zuckerberg is like not how big a fine he should pay or whether he should grow those weird bangs he has. But like, I believe there needs to be a criminal investigation of Mark Zuckerberg. I'm not sure that it's wise that a bunch of my neighbors in Brooklyn were arrested in the last week and went to prison for marijuana, while Mark Zuckerberg's a free man. I just think those positions might be reversed.
Let me ask you about two things on that, but let me ask about the people that also need to be heard. And let me get there by asking you to talk about Cat Cole. Because if there is a myth that people adopt and follow in their lives, the people who are often doing that are, the same as all of us, educated in one way or another, and just seeking to better themselves. So a quick statement about Cat Cole, and then let's talk about what she is doing.
So it's a good opportunity to just say one sentence about the substance of the book, because what I'm giving you tonight is the distilled alcohol ideas, right? Like the pure thing. I'm giving you the tequila shot version. But the book actually does not sound like I sound tonight. The book is stories of people, real people, that I spent time with, reported among, 1 or 2 people per chapter, who are actually living these paradoxes. So the head of the Ford Foundation is someone I spent time with. Bill Clinton is someone I spent some time with. Hillary Cohen, a young graduate of Georgetown who wants to change the world and somehow ends up on a path that is very different from that at Goldman Sachs and McKinsey, is another character. And so this is a story of characters grappling with the ideas, and the ideas I'm sharing with you grow out of that analysis. One of the characters is Cat Cole, a young woman who grew up without a lot of money and who got a job as a very junior job, I think as a first a hostess and then a waitress at Hooters when she was, I think, still in high school, and very quickly was recognized as a very smart, talented person, and was like opening restaurants around the world for Hooters when she was like in her early 20s, and then was promoted up and up, had this fancy job, and then switched over to a private equity firm that owns Cinnabons, and Auntie Anne led to a lot of these regrettable headlines about, Buns, Hooters, there's all kinds of, it's very sad when you Google her, just like, it's a headline writer's fantasy and nightmare. She's a very smart, capable, thoughtful woman who I think could do any number of things in the world. I think she could be a good politician. I think she could be a great business leader in all kinds of sectors. She could be a civic leader. And she has chosen to be a senior person first at Hooters and then at, this company that, in addition to Cinnabon, sells Auntie Anne's pretzel. Basically, like everything that you ever regret eating in an airport, she's responsible for. And so she is not a Koch brother. She is not someone who is trying in some scheming way to grab everything she can. She's a thoughtful person who I met, and I felt it was important to spend time with her and understand her perspective, to understand how this culture trickles down, so that it leads people to kind of just feel like, well, this is the way the world is, and I have no agency. And so we had this conversation, and she basically gives me one rationalization after another for, like, well, Hooters gave those women a lot of scholarships. And you say, like, okay, first of all, we should be having a society where you don't need to necessarily have to dress like that to get funding for education. But in her mind, the scholarships redeemed the thing. In her mind, like, her other friends who worked at other restaurants that didn't have that theme were hit on just as much as she was. So what difference does it make? In her mind, Cinnabon is just like the bakeries of yesteryear. She said that to me. And then she said, well, we do add a shit ton more sugar. And so then I said to her, but what about food deserts? What about the fact that you are often in environments where people don't have other choices or the right information, and there's something almost coercive about this? And she's like, well, that's interesting, but, and it was interesting talking to her. I just realized, like, she just didn't have a system lens. She was a person who had found a way to survive when she was very young, and her dad left, and then 20, 30 years later, is in this system that is making people's lives worse, arguably, in my view, but that she can't escape. And I think it would be easier if we solve these systemic problems systemically, so that we do not rely, as much as we do in America, on people's individual moral grappling to solve our biggest shared problems.
I do find it interesting that for her the step too far was what is probably disingenuous is to go support the Juvenile Diabetes Foundation, which got me to wondering about, you go to these conferences, you, from the front of the book, you were an Aspen Institute Fellow, and you had one other credential that was equally surprising. Visiting scholar at New York University. Where's my other one? Well, I lost it. But point being, you go to those places, and you talk about the other people who go to those places, and I forget the gentleman's name, who are trying to get people to see the system in place. But they're not bomb throwers, because they wouldn't be invited back, I guess. Are you going there as a bomb thrower, or are you invited back anymore?
I'm invited a lot of places once. That's why it's so good to be back here, because this is like a rare case of being invited to the exact same place twice. Even to a better building this time. So maybe Town Hall Seattle is like a little different. I think what happened in my case was some of these larger themes and just questions that prompted the book. This notion that we were living in this time where you couldn't walk down the street in many parts of this country without bumping into a billionaire trying to change the world. And yet, all the economic data that would keep coming out was just getting worse and worse, and the same people were like grabbing more and more of the society's poker chips. And you just started to wonder, like, wait, are they giving or are they taking? Like, what's the fundamental drama here? So that was like the macro context, right? But often for my books, there's been something more personal that prods me into a particular direction. And in this case, the Aspen Institute thing was really that prod. So I was invited into this kind of benevolent, open secret society called the Aspen Institute. which is sort of, like when you go on Reddit and there's all these like weird threads of like guys in their young 20s speculating about how people rule the world. It turns out they're right, and it's the Aspen Institute. And there's a lot of different programs, national security, they have their, their fingers and everything, but the program I was invited to was this program of business people, designed to kind of civilize business people. That was the language they used. To take 20 business people a year who are sort of focused on making money, running their companies, managing their people, and get them to paint on a broader canvas, is the language. Get them to move from success to significance. Get them to read some books, ancient books, debate with each other, share about themselves, have dialogue, sort of like replicating a college dorm room experience. And then hopefully the idea is they would go about, and each of us was supposed to do a project. And this becomes important, a project to make the world better. So you have your job, but then you're supposed to do some project to make the world better. And it was a very nice experience. It was sort of like a wedding. Like, you go to a wedding, you arrive on Friday night, and by like Sunday, you feel like super close to all these people, right? It was sort of like that. You're like thrown in this setting, you meet 4 times for a week each over 2 years, you kind of get close to these people. Most of them are business people, I should say. 20 business people in a room is obviously Ambien in human form. So you never want to have 20 business people in a room. So they would always throw in like 1 or 2 non-business people for like, spice. I was the Indian masala in the room. And it was a nice experience, but then I started to go to that summer reunion with like hundreds of these people who'd gone through this program in the past, the Aspen Ideas Festival, and this and that. And I started to have a realization that I wish I had had on day one, but it took me some time, which was that the very people flying to Aspen to talk about making the world better had flown in from making it worse. And I mean this quite literally. Like, there were like multiple people from Goldman Sachs in this Change the World Fellowship. And at some point it dawned on me, we actually don't need them to fly to Aspen to do more good. We need them to just stay home and do less harm, right? There was a literal Facebook executive in my program, my class. And at some point it occurred to me, like, we don't need him to do a side project to make the world better. We need him to do his day job more honorably. You go to the Aspen Ideas Festival, and it's sponsored by Pepsi and Monsanto. And there's, I'm sure, some health track or nutrition track. And you think, like, we don't need you to come to Aspen to talk about how to make kids healthy. We just need Pepsi and Monsanto to be reined in or maybe just not exist. And so I became curious about why it is that the culprits of this age of inequality, of plutocracy, of so much abuse of power were in the leadership of discussing how to fix what they had broken, right? The house was burning, and the fire brigade turned out to be the arsonists, just wearing suits. And yeah, they're wearing the fire suits, but like, I recognize you from when you lit that fire. And you're trying to actually convince me in this weird way that because you lit it, you know how to put it out. And I was asked to give a talk there. I told you I'm asked to do a lot of things once. I was asked to give a talk there about my second book, which is about a hate crime in Texas. I said yes. I gave them a call or an email and said, it's going to be a little different than that. And I wrote a speech to a room of about maybe the middle section of this room, but much, much richer than the middle section of this room. No offense. Knowing my outlook, you won't be offended. Many billionaires, multimillionaires in that cluster. And I said, you know, you all think you're changing the world, but what if you are what needs changing? What if you're the problem you're trying to solve? And what if you can't solve it because the problem is you? And I got a reaction that I can only describe this way. It's like a standing ovation of people who look like they want to kill you. It's a very weird thing. And later that night, 2 reactions summarized the whole thing. Right as I got off stage, first of all, Madeleine Albright was next up. She came up on stage and like gently disparaged me. Like, you don't say this stuff, right? Madeleine Albright's worked in government her whole, like, right? But you go after these people because her friend was giving away some award on behalf of her late husband who worked at Goldman Sachs and did not appreciate all the Goldman Sachs references in my speech, which I do not regret. And Madeleine Albright gently disparages me in her classy, classy way. I get off stage. A literal billionaire comes up to me and says, thank you for voicing what has been the internal struggle of my whole life. Every time someone thanks me for some gift my family has made, I think of the cigarettes we sold. That's what she says to me. Powerful. And later that night, I go to the hotel bar. I needed it. And this guy comes up to me, private equity man. And private equity man is not just a man, but it's like a type, right? And so private equity man comes up to me, like private equity handshake, extended, pre-extended. You understand what I like the person who just like knows the private equity industry in the audience. Like, yep, I know what you mean by pre-extended. Hand pre-extended, and he's like, firm, nice, firm private equity handshake, and he's like, you're an asshole. So that was sort of the reaction of the book someday.
All right.
Before there was even a book.
I can't believe we've already eaten up so much time. We're going to take questions from you guys, but so the lights can come on and we'll get some questions. Short, concise, don't make a speech, I'll interrupt you. Real quick, how can I ask this? All right, Bill Clinton, who you talk to. Bill Clinton who you say, you know, for all the things he gets, he just doesn't get that he is maybe facilitating the very problems he wanted to solve. And he's gotten I think, very wealthy because of it.
They've made about $250 million after leaving office, according to the Wall Street Journal. Which I believe and the Obamas, to my great disappointment, seem to be going down a similar road. But
they're going to have a TV network to show their stuff on.
I just think, like, these things become so normal to us. Like, why has the presidency of the United States, for good people as well as not good people, essentially become like a platform for becoming a plutocrat?
Well, that's why you can't give Donald Trump too much grief for saying, I'm going to make money by being president, because so did everybody else.
This is the thing. Donald Trump is an exaggeration of a lot of things that are very widespread in our culture. And we would like to believe that he is like a tumor unto himself. He's not. He is a boil on a body that is very badly diseased, and that is diseased in all parts of the body. The media is diseased. Our political institutions are diseased. The cultural beliefs we hold that allow us to see someone like him as anything but a pariah over decades are diseased. And a lot of the work that I think we need to do is, in the Trump era, is to go deeper in our analysis than the word Trump, and understand that we only got him because so much else was broken, and that while we actually don't have that much power over him, we actually do have tremendous power over our culture, because our culture is the sum of what we believe and what we do and what we say.
All right, I'm going to come back to I want to come back to the question of what the next step is. Ma'am. No, you don't have to do anything. It'll come on.
It will? Oh, that's magical. Hi.
How are you?
I'm well. My name is Sarah, and it really is a privilege to speak with you. I'm somebody who watches YouTube videos that feature you, so thank you for being here. There's a lot, so check them out. So I'm somebody who's had the privilege of working both at a think tank in DC and at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And, while those are great privileges and exposed to a lot, I want to kind of give you a background for my question. My observation after spending time in both of these, very powerful settings, is that there seems to be two sides of the same coin of thought in people in think tanks, working with people like Susan Rice and other folks who went into the Obama administration, is that they know best. And that
they know what?
They know best. And that there is at a governmental level, we know best. We know from a policy perspective and from a nonprofit kind of philanthropic perspective, they know best. And what I saw at the Gates Foundation was a technocratic approach. So you said that you were somebody who spoke with a lot of these really high, powerful people. I'm curious if you would speak a little bit more to the mindset, if it's something that you saw, and then what kind of a mindset did you experience that we could not understand unless we were around it, that would drive this type of
you
behavior?
probably understand it very well from your work experience. What I would say is, and there's a lot of things maybe missing from those technocratic spaces. You described it very well. But the biggest thing, if I had to summarize it, was a lens of power, right? Like, there's many different lenses you need to understand the world properly. But the power is like a really important lens, right? And you can't understand most important things in history without a power lens. It's kind of one of the big ones. And I think in a lot of these technocratic spaces, there's very good analytical power. There's like excellent spreadsheets on fleek. I mean, there's a lot of good math. There's a lot of good economist kind of thinking they have available to them, but they just don't understand power. And so you can push something like Common Core, if you're the Gates Foundation, and say, like, we know the right education system for America, we're going to push it. And you have a lot of smart people making sure that it is, like, as smart a thing as it could be. But it seems like it doesn't occur to a lot of people in these spaces that, like, maybe jamming an entire new education policy down the throats of a bunch of state legislatures, many of whom do not have a debate on it before they enact it or pushed to enact it, is actually counterproductive because it fuels the exact fear that right-wing people have about their kids being manipulated and drives turnout for Trump. And that if you don't have a lens of power, a kind of democratic lens, you're just missing these things. And the biggest thing missing, in my view, when you don't have that lens is you start to see problems in an engineering way, which is a kind of often ends up being a win-win way. This whole book is about dismantling the win-win way of looking at the world. The win-win way of looking at the world is like, you got some people up here, you got some people down here, total pity. We should lift these people up so they're like up there with them. And when you have a power lens, you start to look at the situation again and you say, oh, that's interesting. Those people are so high up because they're actually standing on these people. And these people are down here because they're actually being stood on. They're being stood on through tax policy, they're being stood on through wages, they're being stood on through lobbying, they're being stood on through elections that are bought, but they're being stood on. And if you don't have that lens, you don't actually understand why the people up there are up there and why the people down here are down here. So that's what I've found most missing in the technocratic universe. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Summer Stinson, and I have testified at the legislature a lot about taxes and continue to do so. And I really liked what you said about needing to occupy and needing to disrupt in a stronger way, because I was at the rally that Amazon employees put together last Thursday at the Spheres. And there is also a sixth grader, a Seattle Public Schools sixth grader who is Black and Indigenous, who is planning a rally for this Friday at Seattle City Hall in the plaza at noon. But what you said about like we've got to do more to disrupt, if you can talk about that, because we're in a crisis moment right here where we have 1 week and 1 day to our election that we're trying to take back. What can we do in the immediate future, and what can we do here? Seattle has the most upside-down tax code in the state, with the most upside-down tax code in the US, while we have billionaires walking around. And so what can we do short-term and long-term?
All right, let's play a little game. How many of you, be honest, because this is a semi-safe space, how many of you have actively volunteered? I'm not talking, a Twitter like does not count. In the election that's taking place in a week and a day. How many of you have? Keep your hands up. A very small fraction. Is that fair to say? How many of you are willing to commit tonight to change that and get involved in this election over the next week? Anyone? Come on. Come on. We can do better than that. How many of you refuse to get involved in this election over the next week? The vast majority of you. Okay, well, you get the world you deserve.
I do want to put down the name of the sixth grader who is planning the rally and speaking in Seattle at noon on Friday. Her name is Ona, and she goes under the hashtag Ona Takes on Amazon. So I want to make sure she gets credit. She is not here tonight. She's at an NAACP meeting trying to promote this.
Hi, Anand. How's it going?
Very good. How are you?
Good, thank you.
I feel like we're
Take
just
my
having
question.
coffee over here.
Do you celebrate Diwali?
I'm not a big religion person, but congratulations to all the people who are.
Okay. I was gonna say, if you do, happy Diwali.
Yeah, thank you. I know people who celebrate Diwali.
You mentioned
Many of them are friends of mine.
Well, happy Diwali to them.
Yeah, thank you.
You mentioned woke capitalism. Is there such a thing? That's my question.
Oh, that's the whole question? I like that. I think woke capitalism is actually just regular capitalism with a layer of virtue signaling side hustles, So you still run the business in the way that you would have otherwise, or that other people run their businesses, but you have this layer of like, we are Wells Fargo, and we teach consumers financial literacy, which, by the way, is super useful. They do that. That's a real program they have to teach consumers, which is super useful because it turns out that Wells Fargo employees stole a lot of people's private information. So it's wonderful that they offer that CSR activity to protect you against themselves. And so, to me, woke capitalism is a smokescreen for a manic hypercapitalism that has pretty much already destroyed the American opportunity structure, and not satisfied with that, is on track to destroy the planet. Woke capitalism is not very woke at all.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming to Seattle. One of the more interesting interview questions I heard you give was when the person asked you, what's the cutoff for, these plutocrats? Is it the 1%, the 0.1? And you said, there's different tranches. There's the super rich people, but there's also people like, lots of us who have mortgages and benefit from the mortgage interest tax deduction, or, work at some of these companies and tie up our identities to places like this. So, a lot of your book is kind of an us versus them talking about the plutocrats, but I guess what would you say to speak to that more broad definition of?
Yeah, it's a very important point. I think what is very clear is that the bottom 50, 60, 70% of Americans have almost benefited not at all from a generation worth of new shit. So that's kind of the baseline fact. And then the question is how do you carve up the responsibility among those who cornered most of the benefits that did not go to those people, the benefits of change? I think if you take so the interview you're referring to is like the complicity is different depending on how big the slice you want to define is. I think if you want to talk about like the top 20 or 25% of Americans, I think there's a case, that's essentially college-educated Americans, like roughly. There's a bunch of complicity there that has to do with something like the mortgage tax deduction being this massive subsidy to middle-class, more affluent people that may not really be defensible given how little we fund, things to like help people who lost their jobs to China or whatever. There's things, the most egregious to my mind in that 25% group is the fact that we fund public schools according to how nice mommy or daddy's house is, which is not just a bad way to fund public schools, but the most barbaric possible way to fund public schools. And one of the things we can talk about is like, I actually think there's some forms of philanthropy that could help hasten the end of plutocracy, and like philanthropy that would help fund the lawyers who are trying to end that situation where it's legal to fund public schools by property tax. Would be a very great place for philanthropy. So there is that complicity. And then, we all like drink too much plastic water bottles and, things like that. But I want to be very clear that if you look at most of the data, there really does start to be a pretty crazy spike around the 1% and the 0.1% and the 0.01%. And I think sometimes, and Elizabeth Warren had a great answer about this at one of the forums. She's like, we're all pressured to we have climate change because you're not recycling. And it's like, yeah, it's important to recycle or change your light bulb or whatever, but like, let's be clear. This is a problem of like a pretty small number of people capturing power. And yes, there is blame further down, and we do work for those people, and we can't avoid their patronage one way or another. But most of the data supports the idea that we're talking about tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in a society of 300 million people monopolizing a majority of the benefits of the future. And we shouldn't, I think, get duped into thinking that, if only everybody in this room was more responsible about light bulbs, we wouldn't have these problems.
So then do we need a regulatory system from a government that is willing to say to, how much money does Bezos have now? 54 million?
I don't know.
Billion?
He never texts me back.
Do we say to a government, do we have a government like that says, 1 billion's good, and we're taking the rest into the government?
Here's what I say about this abolish billionaires question, which is that like we've tried it the other way.
You mean we made billionaires? What do you mean?
We tried having it be legal to be a billionaire, and I don't think you can say like we didn't give that a shot. So some might be more aggressive than I in calling for like a permanent ban on billionaires. I would just say let's do a moratorium on billionaires.
Well, we had a tax system that was different.
Where for like 5 years, let's start to have the kind of tax policy. And it's not just tax, it's also, there's two things. There's like pre-distribution and redistribution, right? If you actually force someone like Jeff Bezos to pay a higher minimum wage and like give people breaks, they don't have to pee in bottles while they're working, you'd have more money going to wages than to retain corporate earnings. So people would make money less on the way up. And then with whatever money they still make, you've got to do more wealth tax, capital gains tax, inheritance tax. You do all that stuff, more the money they make, which is already going to be a smaller amount, would then go back. And you could structure that in a way where you have no billionaires at all, or fewer billionaires and fewer billions, and like people don't have to work at Hooters to be able to afford going to college. Like we could do that. We could do that. And I would say like, let's try it. And if I'm wrong, I'll come back here in a few years and I will call for, ending the moratorium on billionaires and reinstating the sacred right to be a billionaire.
So that's a government that is much stronger, much more focused on the kind of things we saw in the 1900s than up through the World War I.
Yeah,
progressive era.
And just to be clear, because this is an important place people sometimes push back. It's like, well, why should government do all this stuff? And a very useful framework that I think about is in terms of like, how strong should a government be, right? Because when this country was founded, the government did like a fraction of the stuff it does now, right? So there are people who say like, the founders didn't mean for the government to do all this stuff that it does now. A very good answer to that is, at different moments in history, as societies progress, as societies become more complicated, as they become more interpenetrated around the world, and globalization, all these networks, there start to be increasingly big, complicated forces that have the power to reach down into your life, that you do not, as an individual, Steve, have the power to push back against, right? And so you think about now, the way the world has been set up, not necessarily at your behest, is such that some Chinese party official changing their mind about soybean prices can like bankrupt your family through a set of things, right? That's the world we've set up. And you need a government with commensurate power to the power that these forces have to discombobulate people's lives. So we now have a world where all of our lives can be massively affected by some bank deciding that it wants to lend to black and brown people in ways that are going to bankrupt them and then many, many others. We didn't choose that. We don't really have the power to thwart its influence in Washington, et cetera. If you're going to have private actors able to mess with our lives, we need a government commensurate with their power to play defense. And that, to me, is the case for an activist government that just does more than government did in the past, because these private forces have way more power over us than they did in the past.
How do we go about starting to destroy, wear down and destroy the whole neoliberal wave that has taken over this country in so many ways? You know, billionaire neoliberals who think they're trying to preach to us about how sanctimonious they are. How do we try, this has been going on for 20 years now. How do we try to wake people up to the fact that there are no real liberals in the billionaire class anymore?
I mean, you can invite them to this event. Too late for that, I guess. Look, it's the right question. How do you wake people up? And you know, one of the reasons I wrote the book is because of my own theory of change here, is that I think it's actually incredibly powerful the way in which these plutocrats invented a phony religion that made them good, made government bad, made, you know, philanthropy by people who just finished defrauding society or who are not even finished defrauding society good, and like social security evil. Like that this was a religion that was invented and that many of us fell for, some all the way, some just passively. And to me, it's an incredibly empowering thing to say, like, we can stop believing the phony religion, right? Like, you can stop believing the phony religion. And while you are not a plutocrat, perhaps, chances are in this room, you've used the word win-win unironically in the last calendar year. Chances are you've used the word thought leader, which is another one of my enemies, unironically in the last year, right? Which is a thinker who doesn't challenge power as opposed to an actual thinker, right? You got real feminists, and then you got Sheryl Sandberg, thought leader, trying to convince women that thousands of years of patriarchy is a posture problem. Like, if women were to recline at a different angle, thousands of years of patriarchy would melt away. Women just weren't leaning correctly, apparently. But, you know, a lot of us, like, watched her talks and read her book and, like, fueled a war on us. And so I believe it's possible to stop believing in the phony religion. And I believe when we do stop believing in it, quite quickly, other truths will become very accessible to us. And other people who have been calling for the kinds of policies, the kind of politics that would actually make things better will reappear to us. And we'll realize that they were right there all along, but we hadn't been seeing them properly because we'd been believing this false thing that clouded our judgment.
So the challenge for many of us who lived through and were in the streets for the 60s and 70s is that it's easy not to believe that we just had right-wing messages forced down our throats, but that, for example, the Great Society was not stifled, but it was an experiment that failed, and that the inevitable result of being in the streets is repression. And if we stop thinking about that, you know, that we brought Nixon by being in Chicago, and we brought Reagan, and the inevitable result of this, and our heads start to clear of these things, and we get the Arab Spring melting into hell, and we get the Czech Velvet Revolution disintegrating into chaos. Why will it work? Why will going out there work?
I mean, I think that's, to me, I think there's some truth in what you're saying, but it's an incomplete history. I mean, a lot of those things achieved enormous, lasting, concrete gains, and then there's pushback, but that doesn't mean the gains go away. Like, was there a backlash to women gaining the vote and gaining voice? Sure, but not enough to take away women voting. It was a backlash, right? Was there a backlash to civil rights and the Voting Rights Act? Absolutely. But, and they've tried to go after that law, but black people can still vote now in a way they couldn't before.
Yeah,
so
I specifically chose the Great Society to look at, for example, anti-poverty
I was just listening to a
programs doing
podcast
nothing.
today as an early preview of the hell I'm bound for, in which they were talking about how the Great Society like hugely reduced child poverty numbers. You know, I don't know the data on that. I think the Donald Trumps of the world, but also the plutocrats I write about, depend, I mean, not to call you all out, but like, I was actually pretty surprised by how few people were willing to like maybe commit to being engaged politically over the next week for an election that you all, by your applause earlier in the night, you seem to feel pretty strongly about, but like 90% of the people in the room were not willing to switch from not engaged to engaged. Well, like, then give it to Jeff Bezos. At least he cares. You know, like, and it's, I'm being real about this because I like, these people can't rule alone. There are very, very few of them. They require our passivity. They require our acceptance. And let's be clear about one more thing. This is very important to understand. This is an incredibly sophisticated, high-functioning society. It doesn't always feel like that, but it is. And in many countries, if you had someone like Donald Trump, everything would stop working, right? Your tax returns wouldn't come back. You wouldn't be able to get a driver's license. Passport renewals would stop functioning. The buses, right? Think about it. This is a guy whose malice is tempered only by his idiocy. And, I don't know, 5–10% of people in this country have had their lives materially made worse every day. And probably the vast majority of people, their work goes on as it did before. Their commute goes on as it did before. Their tax returns function fine. The society goes on. And so we can all feel like even the worst doesn't really disrupt everybody's life every day, except at the level of outrage and news alerts. And I think we have to remind ourselves that even though that may be the case, if you are not putting skin in the game to save a city council election or this country from Donald Trump, you are creating the conditions that invite those kinds of predators in.
You guys, I have time for 2 more questions, which are you two, so I apologize to the rest of you, but he's going to sign books, so line up there.
Thank you. Public education has been one of the main pillars of our democracy, but yet it is constantly being eroded by the efforts, especially by the Billionaire Boys Club, to increase privatization. Could you comment on this movement?
You know, it's very interesting. When you write a book, one of the things that happens is people, like you write it with the knowledge you have and the reporting that I did in a limited number of domains. I read the books that I read. I didn't read all the other books. And then the book comes out, and all these people from all these worlds, micro worlds that you don't know the ins and outs of, come to you and tell you what it meant for them. And the biggest one by far for me has been public school teachers, who, in a way that I almost wished I had more of that in the book. Like, to a degree that I did not realize. I mean, I knew that all these billionaires are trying to redo education. I didn't realize how many rank and file teachers have horror stories of billionaires messing with their classrooms. Suddenly they got to use this tablet owned by that company because the founder of that company, through his foundation, gave money to that school. Just think about that. Those are actually different entities, right? But you take money from that foundation, now you got to use that company's admittedly second-rate tablet, and so on and so forth. And I think one of the most interesting, you had these amazing strikes over the last couple of years. I think it's one of the places where plutocracy and democracy have really come head-to-head in this dramatic way. And one of the things I see on Twitter all the time is teachers making these kind of miseducation porn videos about their classrooms, how few crayons they have, holding up we got 18 kids and 2 crayons, you know. We have 300 kids in this school and 6 pieces of paper and 100 more days of art class this year. If you donate now, right, donors choose all these sites. I think we have to actually ask ourselves, what kind of society asks teachers to make personal branding videos for cash-starved classrooms and to perform the poverty of their classrooms for a public audience, with children in these videos, by the way, raising all kinds of legal issues. But you got to put the kids in the videos, otherwise you're not going to get the moolah. What kind of society is doing? I don't think we realize that probably in no European country, most of which are poorer than us on a per capita basis, except Luxembourg. Is Luxembourg even really a country? I'm going to get so much Luxembourg shit from this thing today. Like, it just doesn't happen. By the way, I think in a lot of poor and middle-income countries, it probably also does not happen. We are weird. We are weird. We don't realize how weird we are. We are funding we're having the future of our children depend on whether rich people feel moved by a miseducation porn video into giving money. And we could just tax the hell out of people and pay for it the old-fashioned way, and it's probably better.
Hi, my name is Dana, and I've spent a decade working in philanthropy and then higher education. And one of the things so I'm about 2/3 of the way through your book, but I've also been reading Edgar Villanueva's Decolonizing Wealth. And I think layered on top of everything that you say in your book is also, just kind of the history of this country, in the sense that all of the wealth of this country is built on stolen native land and resources, and then with the labor of Black and brown bodies. And as someone that's even worked within social justice philanthropy, I still struggle with, in the organization I worked for, we receive money that come from many of the plutocrats that you describe. We regrant that money. How do we do that kind of work? The people that are not necessarily the philanthropists, but the people working in the sector, and not be complicit in it?
It's a great question. And thank you, because it got at something I wanted to say at some point before tonight closed, which is, in general, I do not think, as you might have gathered, that rich people or philanthropy or companies are the answer to the current plight. I think democracy that does things over their objection is the answer to our plight. However, it may take a long time to get to the world that I want to live in, with the kinds of taxes on billionaires that we should have, the kind of regulations. And so right now, as your question indicates, we're living in a world in which there is all this money, there are these foundations, there are people working in them, not necessarily owning them, but working in them. Maybe, I know for a fact, because they're like my leakers every day, working in these organizations, not believing in their bosses, but, you know. And I think there's a question of, if you are one of those staffers in one of those nonprofits or foundations, or even if you are one of the woke plutocrats, and there are some. In fact, there's two here tonight I want to acknowledge. I forgot to do that earlier. We got Dan Price in the house. We have Nick Hanauer also, two local. Dan Price, stand up. Nick, are you here? There he is. These are, and I invited these guys because they're like the only rich people I like. But both of them are traitors to their class. And both of them have used their voice and their money to break the taboo on the idea that you can empower people down below at no cost to those on top. Both of them are advocating for making their own class less wealthy, less powerful, less connected. And so I believe that they don't have to be alone, and that it is possible for philanthropy or nonprofit to de-rig the society, to unrig the opportunity structure, but they have to be focused on that goal. So a couple things. One, on each of these issues, I think you can find fake change and real change. And they often look kind of similar on the surface. And in some ways, the book is like a set of infrared goggles to try to tell them apart more clearly. So in public education, pushing Common Core may seem like real change, but it replicates the paternalism that's the problem. Funding those lawyers who are trying to win a Supreme Court case to make property tax-based funding unconstitutional, which will take 25 years if it's even possible at all, right? No one gives those lawyers money, right? There's like billions of dollars for the other stuff, right? But no one's, so give those lawyers money. If you go back to the feminism thing, right? How much attention did Sheryl Sandberg get for a feminism that tried to convince women that the problem is they don't raise their hand enough? How much funding do people advocating universal child care or family and medical leave or different things that have been shown in other societies to actually empower women through policy, and all women, not just the ones who happen to be friends with Sheryl Sandberg? How come those aren't getting funded? So I believe that there is absolutely a role, particularly in a transition decade or two, for nonprofit spaces and philanthropic spaces, and particularly the staffers who are in these things and don't entirely agree with the agenda of their bosses, to organize their giving and organize their programs in a way that would tend towards hastening the end of plutocracy, as opposed to what a lot of philanthropic work does now, which is prolong the survival of plutocracy.
All right. I guess we all better be paying attention to the election and ringing on doorbells. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.